You're listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Here are your hosts, Fran Chismar and Tom Kinezic.
Welcome back to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast presented by Pinelands Nursery. And we have big news today. I am Fran Chismar.
And I'm Tom Kinezic. Welcome to episode 56.
Yes.
And before we get to that big news, since it seems like you guys appreciated our complaining so much, we figured we're going to just do another whole half hour of complaining this time. So,
half hour? You're really limiting me because I could, we could do a couple hours. We could do a marathon.
I think after we got done last time, we realized how frustrated we were because that was only supposed to be like a 5-minute thing on, hey, this is like some of the pains and troubles we're going through right now. And it just turned into like a rant.
It just started oozing out. Although I feel, I will say, I feel that once we did that, it was very therapeutic.
Oh, yeah.
Like I felt much better after
between that and a long weekend.
So I guess we should thank all of our listeners for being our therapists.
Yes.
And allowing us to do that, being our ears and just letting us vent. We appreciate that. I feel bad having done it, but I feel much better.
Yeah. After the fact and after it was published, I'm like, maybe we shouldn't have done that. But at
we
least
didn't
the people,
edit
if anyone got upset, they didn't let us know.
No,
but a lot of people actually reached out and said, oh yeah, I didn't realize how busy it was. I didn't realize how much actually goes into this kind of stuff. So that was nice to hear that happened. So.
And that rant was unedited. So we didn't go back and go, maybe we should take some of that out. We kind of let it free flow. So,
so what is the big news you're talking about?
Well, are we allowed to talk about your promotion? Or should I have asked that before I mentioned your promotion?
No, I guess we can.
All right,
I wouldn't say it's a big promotion.
No, it's a big deal. So Tom has been promoted to general manager of Pinelands Nursery. So you know what? It's very well deserved, and I'm very happy.
Oh, thank you very much. It's always nice when you get a promotion right after you make like a $10,000 mistake. So
we've all, if it makes you feel any better, we've all done it. I shared with you. I know. Early on in my career, at the first nursery I worked at, I was in charge of checking irrigation, and I would come in on the weekends, and it was a 3-day 4th of July weekend, and we'd hit 100-degree temps in all 3 days. And there was an issue where one zone of trees was running for 5 minutes, and that's it. It was supposed to run for like an hour and 20 minutes, and it ran for 5. So I just happened to be there after it was running both days, and I was touching the root balls, and everything was wet. But I'm colorblind, and the leaves were starting to turn, and I couldn't see it. And when we came back to work, like I got pulled in, and they're like, "What do you see there?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" And they're like, "You don't see that." And I'm like, "See what?" And we had everything defoliated.
Yeah,
it was turning color, but I couldn't really see.
Sounds like a really good excuse, Fran. This whole colorblind thing. I'm wondering if that's like just a whole ruse you've got going for the last many years. But
I'll never tell. So no, we've all done it, and that's where it's a learning.
Oh yeah,
it's a whole learning process. You can be told things, you can read things, but until you experience it and you learn to adjust, it happens. Yeah. It's the best of us, but it's very well deserved. I'm very happy.
Well, thank you very much. And but moving on to today's guest. Today we actually have on a listener who's actually starting his own podcast and blog called Growing with Nature. And I actually took some time and listened to it last night, and it was really good. And I left you a review because I know I always ask people to leave us reviews. So I figured I should probably make this a two-way street if I can.
Now, I feel guilty because I did not get a chance to listen last night. I wanted to, and I didn't get the opportunity, but I will listen and I will rate and review.
Yeah, no, so I learned a lot. And even though they are all the way across the country, I still learned a lot. So with that, Darren, why don't you take a little bit of time and introduce yourself and what your new venture is?
Yeah, well, hi everyone, and thanks for having me on. Yeah, my name's Daron Williams, and I'm over in Western Washington, so a little opposite side of the country. But yeah, so my background is a little bit mixed. I'm basically a restoration ecologist, but I'm also been a lifelong gardener, and I work for the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. And basically in that role, I'm helping to support the what we call our nearshore programs, which is basically, I live on the Puget Sound, which is, just really large estuary. And, there's a lot of work to recover and restore those shorelines.
Mhm.
And so I'm helping to support a range of programs that are involved in different aspects of that. But my background, I started out kind of Eastern Washington, which is much drier, and I was a hydrotech for the USGS. So I kind of have a water background. Used to
Mhm.
spend time in northern Idaho too, working in streams and rivers. That was a big part of it. And then over time, kind of shift, basically what kind of motivated me is to move towards restoration was I saw a lot of the issues in rivers and streams that were coming from the uplands, from like logging, causing runoff issues, other things like that. And I started wanting to get involved in helping to address those problems I was seeing. And that kind of got me shifted gears to to working for a land trust at one point, running a restoration program, and then more recently shifting to the state and helping with their shoreline programs.
Awesome. Very, very cool. So I've already, we for our listeners that don't know, we always share questions with our guests beforehand, so they kind of know where we're going. And I'm already going way off, way off script. So just because it kind of, I'm curious from a perspective from another part of the country, what, for maybe it's just me, but when I think of the Pacific Northwest, I picture a more pristine and cleaner version of the U.S. than what we have here in the Northeast. And we just had an episode with Joe Cermelli from Meat Eaters, and we're talking about his opinion on water quality. Having worked with water throughout your career, what is your view on where we're at water quality? Is it improving? Is it declining? Is it an issue? Just from another perspective in another part of the country.
Yeah, it really depends on where you're at. Even like in this one state, it changes a lot. A big issue that we have over here is water temperature. Like a lot of our rivers, the riparian, the vegetation along the rivers has been removed, and they get really hot, sometimes reaching temperatures that like salmon, which is obviously a very important wildlife species for here, multiple salmon types, but the salmon can't survive if the temperatures get too high. We're reaching those temperatures. We have issues with our hydroelectric dams, which provide great service for the community, but at the same time they exacerbate a lot of those issues. And they trap sediment too, so some rivers are becoming sediment starved. There's you don't get the right type of bars or or material for the salmon to lay their eggs in. Sometimes they get filled with sand, sometimes not. So you have those issues. But then we also have, like in the Puget Sound, there's issues with septic tanks put right on the shoreline, and there's really nowhere for it to go. So, it's a range of issues. But, it's also interesting, like in Washington, you talk about kind of being pristine. We have the Cascades, which are pretty nice, the Olympics, other mountain ranges, foothills, Rockies. But we also, like, most of the state's population is concentrated within just a few miles of one freeway that runs up and down the Western Washington. So, in that area, you have a very high dense population. But then you have vast other parts of the state that are very rural, very open. I grew up in far eastern Washington, which is much more rural than where I live now, Western Washington. And so it does kind of depend. Logging, resource extraction in general is a really big industry across the state too. So even areas that look more pristine, as you learn to look at a forest, when I was being an ecologist, you start noticing that, well, they're all the same age. So they may look like a nice forest, but it's a tree farm really in a lot of ways.
Wow. I once, and I'll steer us back on track, I promise. Because I'm already thinking, like, we have to have Daron on again at another time so we can talk more about this. But I'd seen from an ecologist, it was a presentation about forests in Pennsylvania, and it was saying there is no old growth forest left in Pennsylvania. Even what you see in Western Pennsylvania with mountains, they're like, that's all been logged. That's all second generation, nothing. Like if you picture what it should be, it's not that at all. So what you're thinking as pristine wilderness really isn't, because it's been touched by human hands and changed already. And that's kind of like when I think of the Pacific Northwest, I think of, all that's been untouched, and but you have logging, you have all, it's just our perception here because we have so much dense populated cities and so forth. It's just, to me, it's almost like a place that doesn't exist. To me, it's like New Zealand almost, when I think about it. But it's one of my favorite places to visit. So
yeah.
So
yeah, we actually have. I was just gonna say we have very little old growth left, unfortunately, in this state. Like that was a big issue actually in the 90s, if I'm remembering the timeline right. But with the spotted owl and the debate over trying to protect the last of the old growth, because the spotted owl relied on old growth forests, and it was also important for a lot of these logging communities, small towns. And even though it was like just protecting a very small percentage of what historically was here, that was still had a big economic impact, and it was a big debate in the state. And eventually they did protect some of what was left, but it was just a handful of pockets left, unfortunately.
Gotcha. Well, we will definitely have to have you on again so we can have
like
I already steered us in a different direction that I want to go in. But one thing that I love about you is as soon as you joined our Facebook group, the Native Plants Healthy Planet Facebook group, you came in and became a big part of that community right away. And you have extremely interesting posts that everyone kind of gravitates to.
Yeah, you chime in a different way than most, because one, you're from a completely different part of the country than most of the people in that group and most of our listeners, but it was also directly tied to food. It wasn't just about birds or pollinators or just flowers. It was really a lot about food and all that stuff as well. So
yeah, we're just kind of wondering where that love came from and how you got to where you are. And I'd love to talk about your property as well as we progress and what you've done and what you've accomplished.
Yeah. I grew up with a family that gardened. So like my whole life, I've always been growing food, and a lot of that in the past was more traditional kitchen garden, type traditional veggies, the things that people are very familiar with. And so I always had that background, and we would pick berries that we'd find, and so I was kind of aware of some wild edibles in that sense. But it was more as I started getting my ecology training, doing restoration work, I started really being interested in like, well, can these be combined? I felt like they were often separate, in conversations, like people growing food were different. Those discussions were different than the people trying to restore wildlife habitat. And, so I started looking at that, and that really got me interested in the native edibles and just learning more about them and asking the question, can these native edibles be grown in a garden? Can they be grown in, not just because I see people foraging for them, going out into woods or, meadows, other places, more natural areas, and foraging for these. But it's like, well, what if we brought them home? What if we put them in our own yards? Like, can that be done? And that's really, because I feel like, there's our society as a whole, a lot of people don't feel, they feel a little disconnected from nature. Nature's kind of out there, it's somewhere you go visit. It's not in our own backyards. But like, I love going to national parks. We have Mount Rainier really close to here, and it's lovely there. But I actually find I see more wildlife in my own backyard than I do when I go to the national parks, just because there's always so many people walking around everywhere. Like the animals avoid the trails. So, it's like you rarely see a lot of the bigger wildlife. Sometimes you see elk or a bear off in the distance, but here, and we see just dozens and dozens of birds almost every time we look out our window. We're getting new wildlife all the time as we've been restoring our place. But I also wanted to feel connected to the land. And, it's when the land is providing you some of the food that you need to survive, or that at least that you're consuming on a day-to-day basis, that gives you a lot more of a connection to that place than if it's just a place for wildlife exclusively. And I think, part of it is that it can do both. You look at how native peoples have managed landscapes throughout, the time there, in the past and to now, they didn't have that disconnect. It wasn't like a wild area and then their area. It was all one area, and they relied on those foods, and they still do. And we can, a lot of those foods we just don't know about them. Those of us who are not from those cultures, and it's just kind of trying to bring that back and discovering it and learning and just accepting it. I really feel like, for example, a salad, a salad being eaten in England, being eaten in New Jersey and a salad here in the Pacific Northwest should all be different. Like they shouldn't be the same. There may be some things the same, but because we're all temperate climates, for example, but there should be plants that are unique in every place. And that I feel like we just don't have that connection to where we live right now.
No, and that's a great point. And I think when you were saying people think that nature is over there, even their idea of what nature is skewed, where an athletic park could be nature to them, when it's really a manufactured nature that doesn't even have a lot of native plants in it. It's just a manicured area that's open that may have raccoons or groundhogs or something like that, or squirrels. But once you have that connect, there's a different respect for that land. And I think that begins to change too. So,
and another important part of it that I never really thought of, because like I did some like mild foraging just growing up, and then my brother does a little more, but Sam Thayer brought it up even a little bit, and I've seen a lot more now, is if ramps are really popular in this area. Well, if everyone found out about ramps and everyone went out to go get ramps and they all knew where the spots were, the ramps wouldn't be there anymore because they'd be over harvested. So being able to have some of that in your yard now allows you to cultivate what you would need. You're not going to overtake from that, because if I overtake, I'm not going to have enough, and you're not taking from a wild place anymore. So that's not to say no one's taking from that wild place, but that's one less person who knows where they are and is going to get them. Which is really important, because those plants are important for wildlife and other things as well.
Now, ramps is a buzzword right now.
I was just using that one because everyone knows.
No, it is. Everyone knows it.
People know that.
But apparently you need more than just ramps, to do this sustainably. So, and you mentioned historically, in a historical context, and we know a lot of that's been lost, and that's something Samuel Thayer talked about as far as a disconnect. Some of that disconnect, they wanted to happen. They wanted to have people have a disconnect with the land, the government. Do you do, like, when you started this, did you do some historical background looking just to find out what should be there? Because in a lot of respects, what should be there isn't anywhere near where you're at sometimes. So, like, what was that part of your starting process?
Yeah, I mean, when I moved to Western Washington from Eastern Washington, and the climate's so different here that it was kind of, I had to rediscover a lot of the plants anyways. So I'm starting to do restoration work here. I had to just start exploring and learning, and getting comfortable with the plants that grew here. So learning about the edibles, in some ways that was the natural extension of that work that I had to do. But I did start looking up things, and there's some sites out like online that, like, one that I really like using is called Plants for a Future. And it's a UK site, but they have plants from all over the world, and they don't highlight whether they're native or not, but they have a lot of plants. So when I would find a native plant, I'd be like, oh, that's interesting. I would just copy its scientific name, put it into that database, and look and see what pops up. And it was just kind of exploring and finding things like, oh, that has an edible use that I didn't know about. And they always, reason I like that site is they give their sources. So like following those sources, I found a book that's Ethnobotany of Western Washington. And it was published in the 40s, and it was a researcher. She went around and interviewed tribal members all up and down Western Washington and documented how they used these various plants. And so, learning, I wouldn't have known about that resource because, it's an old book. It's been republished, but it's kind of fairly obscure.
Yeah, I'm sure you're not walking into your local Barnes and Noble and just pull that off the shelf.
But that was kind of exploring, finding that found a native plant nursery in this area that focuses on native edibles. So awesome. That helped too. And they looking at their site and just different ways of kind of exploring and finding resources. But every year I find I'm learning more new ones. Like I have a list of new plants that I want to try out this fall, because every fall I like to add some new plants. But yeah, I mean, there's just sometimes it just takes exploring. For example, I was looking up plants in your guys' area because I was curious, and the New Jersey state flower, the common blue violet, is edible and has nice tasting leaves from what I was reading. And like I'm sure a lot of people over there may not know that that state flower is one that you could eat.
Yeah.
I agree. I think that's not a very common fact. We should put a poll up just to ask.
How many people knew you could eat the state flower?
Yeah, but
That would be a fun survey too. Is how many state flowers are edible?
oh, I like that.
Across the
I like
country.
that.
That's someone's got to do that homework for us. I don't think we
I'm
can,
not doing it.
but
From a perspective, just I love we tend to, for the most of the people that we talk to, we're in the Mid-Atlantic or the Northeast. But do you find, now that you're looking for some of these natives, are natives easier to find in your area? Is it still difficult? Like here, I know for homeowners, they have a hard time finding native plant material or people that focus. Is there a different focus? Like, is it better known or better publicized there to find than most would think?
Yeah, finding the right places to look can be a challenge, because the general retail nurseries that most people will go to often won't have those plants, or they'll have, the kind of selected variety of it that, are questionable sometimes. But, there are ones around, but I've been trying to help people in this area learn about them, but sometimes it does, like, I always do my plantings in the fall or winter, partially because I order them wholesale because that was the easiest way to get them. And so I group them all up because I have to get them in bundles of 25 or 50, and it's a little harder, if somebody's just wanting to plant one or two plants, or just get started. The conservation districts, are also a good place, though, that they, at least the ones here, I don't know, they probably don't do this everywhere in the country, but the ones here all do native plant sales.
Awesome.
So, and there is a pretty strong native plant movement in this area, but it's driven by the restoration work. So that's one thing I've found, is that the plants that are available are the ones that are best kind of planted in mass in, kind of fairly expensive restoration projects. So sometimes that doesn't include the edible herbaceous plants that I might be wanting to find. So sometimes I've struggled not to find native plants, but to find the, this one particular like native veggie that I want to grow, because it's not used in restoration projects. So then it's not being grown by the nurseries.
And that makes sense. And you have a really good point that most of what is grown for natives that is marketed is really for pollinators or for wildlife, but not for human consumption. Obviously people will buy blueberry bushes because they know blueberries are edible and they want to eat them, but it kind of drops off from there. So it's really, you're talking about two different things. We're talking about for human consumption. So I know in our correspondence, you had thrown out the term food forest. And I wanted to see if you could expand on that and explain to everyone what a food forest is.
Yeah. So food forest, the term, it's kind of been coined through the like permaculture movement. But the basic idea is that you're trying to grow food in a way that mimics a forest. And, it's often been viewed as something that's common more in the tropics, because a lot of it's actually historically a lot of, and today too, a lot of indigenous cultures naturally did this. This is what they did. And areas that researchers that visited these islands, explorers, they thought these islands were all natural. It looked like a jungle, but it was actually a managed food forest, you could call it that, using the modern term. And it's a landscape that's been managed for human use. Food forest because it's mimicking a forest, but here in Western Washington, there was our old the prairies, and these prairies were managed by the native peoples, through fire regiments. They did that for Camas and other things. So these prairies, they were, they formed after the ice age, after the glaciers retreated, but then it was humans that maintained them and kept them around. And that's resulted in, now today, it's hard. These prairies are disappearing because the forests are replacing them. So they were a human created landscape that supported wildlife, but but also was managed for human, to provide for humans. And in some ways, a food forest is that same concept, but being done in more of in a forested environment. And what I like to try to tell people is, you don't have to have like a dense forest, like a food forest. I like to think that it's more like you're mimicking in the temperate climates where we don't get as much sunlight. It's more mimicking like an early successional forest, like after a forest fire goes in, you have more open, you have a lot more understory.
Mm.
You're getting some filtered sunlight. So you could have your fruit trees, but then underneath that, you could have a lot of these native veggies or other, food plants, even classic lettuce, tomatoes, could grow under there.
Mhm.
It's funny because when you just mentioned prairie, that's not something I would have thought of for your location, because I just think rainfall, and I think that much rainfall, it wants to be a forest. So, but it would make sense if they were managing it with fire to keep it that way. So that really does change, I guess, edibly what you would have, because I guess you're trying to keep that early successional.
In some
type.
way, it depends on what you're going for. So you can have, like, if you're an early successional model, will have a lot more vegetables in it, but you could have like a closed late successional stage one that was more focused on nut trees, fruit trees, and maybe mushrooms being cultivated underneath it. But you're gonna, it's so much shadier, you're obviously going to get a lot less of those kind of veggies. And the idea with the food forest is basically you're growing food in you're stacking layers. You're basically, you're getting a yield from your fruit trees. You're getting a yield from any climbing vines that you might have. You're getting a yield from plants growing on the surface. So in the same area that you might have grown just like a crop, you're actually getting a whole bunch of these yields that can add up to actually a lot more food than a classic kind of setup, because you're growing in multiple layers.
Gotcha. So one thing I just made me think of is kind of like, if you grow it, they will come. Even though you're growing for yourself, you're creating an ideal habitat as well for wildlife. How much predation occurs when you're trying to work this process?
Brandon, this is where you should have listened to his podcast, because he talks about it.
Well,
so you should have done your homework.
I'm trying to lead him in so he can say I spoke about this on my podcast and promote it. That was my save right there.
It's interesting. This is one reason why I'm really, trying to develop systems that combine native plants with the, human focused landscapes to kind of really find a way to combine those systems. Because I've found that when I plant the native, berries and shrubs, even ones that I don't eat, but the birds love, like, for example, we have a cherry tree, a nice pie cherry tree that was here when we moved in. And, the starlings and other birds would kind of swarm in and take and eat them all, and we wouldn't get very much at all. But we planted a hedgerow right along it, filled with native plants, our red flowering currant here, oso berries, other ones that just produce, fruit around the same time. And over time, the birds, even though we have more birds than we ever have had before, they like those native ones far better. They go to those, and it's spreading them out. And that's kind of like, I always say, like, you should plant for the wildlife first before you plant for yourself. Because when you say you take a lawn, and this is what people do, they take a lawn, they put a vegetable garden in it, they're basically creating like an oasis in a desert. Like, there's no food anywhere else, there's no food for people, there's no food for wildlife in that lawn, so that garden is the only place that anything's going to eat. So of course everything's drawn there. But if you plant, the native plants first and do things like that, and you kind of support the wildlife, then the garden doesn't really stand out when you put that in. And that's been how it's worked for us. And, that's why one reason too, that it's kind of, the native edibles are so great, is because you can eat them, but so can the wildlife. So you're getting kind of both sides at the same time. And, I found that those plants too, they don't tend to get overwhelmed by the predation. I mean, there are exceptions, like obviously deer can come in and just be an issue. We've actually had to exclude deer from our property because it was just that they were the one that was keeping us from getting things established. But otherwise, we get more birds every year. It's been amazing seeing how much comes in, and other wildlife. But yeah, we get more harvest, not less.
I guess a good way to look at it is we're part of the wildlife. And if we're, obviously on your own property, you're not having an outbreak of overpopulation in humans. So you're being careful of what you harvest so that you're not completely wiping something out. And I would imagine wildlife is on their own doing the same thing, unless the ecosystem's out of whack and you're having a, 200 deer per square mile come through and wiping everything out. So that would make perfect sense. Do Do you, because we mentioned gardening and we mentioned foraging, do
Mhm.
you see a distinct difference between the two terms?
Yeah, it's interesting, like whether or not what I do at my place is is foraging or am I harvesting, or like going out and gardening, because like I can go out in my front yard and there's food all over the place. They're all most of them are native plants, but it doesn't look like a garden. That's a food forest. It's a young food forest, but also still pretty open. And it's hard to, I think somebody would go out there and they wouldn't look at it as a garden, and what in a lot of ways it's more like I'm foraging. But what's really different is that I've planted everything, so it's not a landscape that is, the plant communities are not what you would have found in an untouched natural area, but they are all native plants to my area. Um but that's kind of the thing, is like with the food forest is you're mimicking a forest, but you're growing the things that are edible. So and it's sometimes it's hard to say, like, what am I foraging or am I going out, because I think foraging often is where you're going out to an area where no one's planted anything,
Yeah.
where people haven't done that. But that also gets into some interesting sides with like um indigenous peoples, how they manage the land is a lot of times people viewed what they did as just hunter gathering,
Yeah.
but yet they went out and they were replanting, and what, they weren't just foraging in the way that we tend to think about it. They were prioritizing certain species over others. They were creating what looked wild but was really gardens.
Yeah.
There's interesting aspects here where in the salt marsh, at the edge of the salt marsh, it looked just like field, like native plants. They were all native plants, but they were being carefully managed to
Mhm.
increase the production of a few key species over others. And so I think it's not that hunter gathering idea. It That's kind of closer. I think when we think of foraging, it's more, we think of that like you're going out to an unmanaged area.
Yeah. One of the things it just reminded me of, and I don't remember where I originally heard this, but with pawpaws, which are
Mhm.
popular in the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic states, they were really common along river corridors. And like I said, I don't remember who told me this, but it was basically, they said it was Native Americans typically brought the seeds with them and
Yeah.
kind of planted those along. They would often travel along the river corridors because it was the easiest hiking, and they would kind of plant them along those routes. And I know, friend, you referenced in one of our books about New Jersey native plants, the only place that they were really native, pawpaws were native in New Jersey, was right along
The
the
Delaware River.
And it was just, so yeah, in that sense,
They were managing it, so they'd
they
have
were
food along
managing
their
it,
trips.
so they
Yeah.
had food along the trip wherever they happened to be along the
Yeah.
river at that point. So,
And that
yeah,
could be viewed as a food forest. The results.
exactly.
Yeah. But the funny thing is, if you look at historical data, that's considered where they're native to, but they're not native to that area.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So it's very interesting to do that. And I know Samuel Thayer had mentioned, like, he feels that the term hunter gatherer has a negative connotation too, almost
Mhm.
like, all right, if you're a hunter gatherer, you're a savage. But it's way beyond that. It was very methodical, and it's such a connectivity that we almost don't even comprehend, because
Mhm.
that was their only way of life. That's what they had
Yeah.
to live
There
by.
was no grocery store. There was no like shipment of whatever coming in. It was, you had to
That
go
was
out
it.
and get it, and you needed to have food security. That was one way to have food security.
So
And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, in many ways, it's farming. It's as
Yeah.
advanced as any farm, especially during that time period. When you look at like what people were cultivating in fields, all the work that it went in to make those fields happen. It's equivalent. It's just a different way of doing it.
Yeah.
But it's still, you have to understand the plants, the timing, when to harvest, when not, how to. There's still so much knowledge that went into creating those landscapes that allowed them to thrive. And I think that's, to me, like when I look at, like, I grew up gardening, having a kitchen garden. And I find though now growing the native veggies and and also other perennial foods a lot more satisfying, because like I remember like my kitchen garden this year, in like early spring, even up till now, things were just getting going. There wasn't much. It was fairly bare. I kind of keep the soil mulched, but like the lettuce were tiny. I couldn't even plant tomatoes yet, all that. But yet my food forest was just filled with abundance. We were harvesting salads from it every day, because like all the native veggies were already up and thriving and growing great. And like we were harvesting all winter long salad greens, and we can get all of our greens now from a mix of native vegetables and perennial vegetables that,
Awesome.
a few of them aren't native, but it's like they're just there, and we can just walk out and go on a walk through our property and just harvest them. And so it's gardening, but it's a different type of gardening. It's gardening in a way that really does create, the result of it is a landscape that doesn't look like a farm, at least the classic farm. It looks like a natural area.
So we need you to donate to science your gut biomes, just so they can research. That was something we've talked about on a prior episode about soil, just the difference in our food and how we eat, and how the biomes in our own body have changed just based on the preservatives. So here's something. Well, I guess here's the next question for me. Like, in order to maintain this, you think of traditional agriculture and you think of herbicides and insecticides. Are you having any kind of issue that way in a balanced ecosystem without having to spray?
Yeah, well, I don't use any sprays. But one thing that I do is I really prioritize creating habitat for the predators. So, I talked about earlier, planting for wildlife goes beyond just planting plants. It's also creating the spaces for them. So like, even in my kitchen garden, I have areas set aside where I have log piles, rock piles, snags. Like I have snags right in my kitchen garden beds. Awesome. And, like just the other day, there was a garter snake sunning itself in my garden on the logs I put there. And, and I found them living in those piles. And the garter snakes here, they eat slugs. And so, I really want them to be around because they're going to eat the slugs. I saw a study that said the average Seattle garden has 6,000 slugs in it. And it's just like, you're never going to deal with if you're trying to fight those pests, basically, if you're using the pesticides, or even organic approaches, like, or non like harmful versions, like, a cup with beer buried down so the slugs go down in it, like something like that, you're taking the role of the predator. Like you're having to control the population yourself. And I'd rather, get the garter snakes, get more songbirds, get frogs and toads and salamanders and, centipedes that eat slug eggs, and, ground beetles, that eat the slugs. Like and that works for a lot of the common garden pests that people have issues with. We have a barn owl box because we have issues with voles. So, doing that, under my deer fence, I put tunnels that coyotes can come and go through, to make sure that they can come in to still eat the rabbits and eat the voles and things like that. So it's, it's kind of, so that's a big part of it. I don't use pests or sprays to control the pests, but I'm actively creating habitat that draws in all the predators, for the pests. So I don't have to manage them so intensely.
That is so much is always focused on people wanting to remove predators because of fear or different things, but without predators you have an unbalanced ecosystem. You really need that combination of both, and I love that you're doing that. I really do. And I know you've posted in the group many times photos of like placing snags and things like that, and that's wonderful. And that just proves that you can have these native things edible and good for you without overusing one tool too much. It's more balanced in creating for everything, rather than I have this tool, I'm going to overuse it and destroy it. So I'm curious too, if I'm sorry, you were going to say something. I apologize.
Oh, no, it's all good. I was just going to add that, and the benefits, the ecosystem, everything's so connected that when you put in a log pile or a snag, things like that, like we see mason bees and other native pollinators, using those. So instead of like the classic mason bee box, that people make, it's like, that's great if you don't have any of this natural, habitat, but they don't need that to survive. They need those logs. They need those old, stalks of dead flowers, or, like all that. So like I leave all those in instead. And so every year we've been seeing more and more of these, little native bees of different types. And it's because of so those same things that we're putting in to create habitat for the predators are also creating habitat for our native pollinators. Bumblebees can overwinter in them. It's it's what a natural landscape would naturally have. Like landscapes here that's one of our big issues, is they're heavily devoid of wood. Like normally downwood, like snags were common in old growth forests. They're really rare now. Big logs, like the old reports from the old growth forest, you used to be able to just walk on logs all through them and never touch the ground.
Oh, wow.
And we just don't see that anymore. So in a lot of ways, what I'm doing to create habitat for predators is also mimicking that structure that used to exist naturally, which is why you get all these other ripple effects.
Wow. So how long for your home food forest, how long of a journey has that been for you? How long have you been working on that?
Well, we bought our place at the end of the summer in 2016.
Okay.
And it's pretty much, there was a cherry tree, there was a few other ornamentals, but it was all just grass lawn. So like basically every year I've been taking out more and more grass. We have a kind of front backyard area that's about a third of an acre, a little less, and then our whole property is just under 3 acres. So I've been focusing on the area around the house, and it's every year, just doing more and trying. We started out getting our hedgerows up, partially for privacy, and things like that, but also for wildlife. It's a little bit. It provided both functions, and it's changed a lot. The hedgerows, the oldest ones are probably about 4 years old, 3 years old now, or going into their 4th year. And some of our areas are only a year old. Like we just put in a little wildlife pond last October.
Awesome.
That's brand new, but it's just kind of constantly every year doing more and expanding, and depends on what I have time to do, but it's just constantly kind of expanding and adding more. And I'm always trying to mix in more native plants too. So, researching ones, trying to, especially the herbaceous ones, the non-woody ones, because those were the ones I didn't know as well for my restoration work. So, we're always trying to mix those in and add more of those. Even this year in the fall, I want to start adding in some native veggies into my kitchen garden, which I hadn't done as much. So we're looking into growing those as like a living mulch, that ones that stay small enough that they won't outcompete, like even a lettuce will get bigger than them.
Nice. Since its inception, have you noticed a difference in your soil?
Yeah, it's interesting. A little geological history for our area. This area was under a lake in the last ice age, so it's actually a very young soil, because of that. So it's very silty clay because base of a lake, and so that's what we started with. And in the summer, it's just rock hard, turn gray, just become as hard as concrete. In the winter, it's like just clings to the boots and everything. It's just a sloppy mess. But now, like in the areas that are about 4 years old, so like under the cherry tree, which is one area I started, was just a lawn, and it was that kind of thick, heavy, silty clay. And now it has that crumbly feel to it. It has that earth, kind of like, it feels more like a forest floor. It's still a little heavy, but it's getting darker. Like it's now, instead of gray, it's brown. Yeah, and it's like, but we put down a ton of mulch too. But then, our goal is we start with mulch to get rid of the grass, but then our goal is to get living plants to replace it. So I don't want to see any mulch except for what's in my paths. Eventually, that's the ultimate goal. And that's really, it's really improved the soil. It's been interesting to see how fast it actually can improve.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Would you say that this form of gardening has made you more popular or less popular with your neighbors?
Oh, that was my next question.
I'd say at first they were confused and wondering what we were doing, especially when we were putting the hedgerows right on the boundary. Yeah. But since then, they've actually really like it. Like they see the increase in birds. I was careful to pick a lot of native plants that got really nice flowers along there. So like we have our native rose, other ones, and my neighbor, direct neighbor, he has beehives, so he loves all the flowers I've added. He's very happy because of that. But yeah, they've made a lot of comments about how beautiful it is now and how much more wildlife they see. I wouldn't say they fully understand everything we're doing, but they can appreciate it though. But it did, at first they were unsure, about it and what was going on. It was a big change from the open fields that they'd always kind of been next to.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I was wondering just because you started talking about the tunnels for the coyotes to get in. And
Yeah.
I know just on our local like town's Facebook page the other day, there was someone who said, "Oh, I have coyotes in my backyard. What am I gonna do?" And
Yeah.
there was like it just like turned into 100+ comment thread about coyotes and how people were seeing coyotes in backyards. Oh, you live in an area with coyotes. That's
that's
what
yeah.
it is.
yeah.
Yeah. And we, so far they've been happy with things. We've made a lot of changes, but I've had people stop on the road and tell me how much they love what we're doing. And, we're right on the busy road. So we get a lot of people driving by every day. And, so far all the comments I've gotten has been good. There was one person early on that was just making a comment about that I was letting our lawn go just get too tall, but that was because I was getting ready to sheet mulch it. I was like, well, I don't really want to care. I don't care about mowing it. I'm going to put cardboard down on it. But once people see the results, then they've been happy. I think it's more the transition. Sometimes people are unsure because no one else is doing, like no one in an immediate area around us is doing the same things that we're doing.
Yeah. There was going back to the snags too. I just remember this story from one of our New Jersey Native Plant Society meetings, because a lot of people know the value of snags and want to add them, but they live in an area that has a homeowners association or something where they aren't allowed to have like accumulating junk, I guess would be the letter of the law. And the one lady who I met a couple of times, and she had moved down from Canada and was living in New Jersey, and unfortunately she moved back to Canada. But she was like, "Oh yeah, I know how to get around it. You need to like encourage them to have like, it was some like rare endangered species of frog." And she's like, and then they can't get rid of it once the frogs are there because it's home to an endangered species. So she's like, "So go find these frogs and put them in your stuff."
Oh,
Like, I guess it works, but yeah, maybe not the route you're supposed to take.
no.
Yeah. Well, what's funny is one of the native veggies that I'm growing is actually threatened to endangered in certain areas of its native range. It's easy to get from the native nurseries, and it's super easy to grow. Like it's self-seeding all over in my place right now. But we have a few dozen of it, and there's a native bee that only uses that one type of plant. So like it's endangered. I don't think it's in my area. It's more down in Oregon.
Okay.
But so sometimes you can, get I like to include these plants when I'm not going out to a wild area and digging them up, but they are pretty rare in nature, in these wild areas, but I can get them from nurseries and plant them here. And so it is kind of fun. I don't know if it would count, but it's been fun to have.
No, but if it attracts special, the bees that specialize or something, we don't encourage people to go out and relocate wildlife for your own personal use.
No.
If you happen to create a habitat that attracts them, that's great.
I'm definitely hopeful that we can attract some endangered species here. That's
awesome.
I'd love that. Obviously I'm not going to go out and get them, but I would love to have them show up. And to me, every time I see a new species show up, that's just a sign that what I'm doing is right. So we have a degraded gully kind of area that's outflow from a stormwater pond from the school that we live next to. And I've been trying to turn it into a wetland and restore it. And, we had a beaver show up, and then we had great blue herons show up, and it was and then we had, frogs, salamanders. And I was like, okay, this is working.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great story. What I love about this conversation is we often focus on restoration, kind of like how people picture nature is somewhere out there. We picture restoration or not promote, just kind of frame restoration as something that happens out in nature, in the wild. It's somewhere else, but you're showing how you can make a difference on your own property. So for other listeners that are interested, and I know just from your post in our Facebook group that a lot of our listeners are interested. What is a great place for the average homeowner to start if they were interested in this?
Yeah, I really do like what Douglas Ptolemy has been promoting with the kind of that backyard or homegrown national park, that idea, because I do think you're right. Restoration is often seen as like out there, it's like a project somewhere else, not in where I live. It's interesting for somebody to start out. One place I always tell people with these native plants is just to start observing and learning, because often people they don't know the native plants that grow right around them, and I think sometimes it's just learning about them, and seeing what stands out. And But then, often like say like if you want to go like if in the spring, people are often wanting to plant, like add new flowers or things like that. It's like, try just picking a couple native plants to start out, like that you can find, locally, and plant those and expand. We started out with our hedgerows, which, as living fences, but you can start with just like a single tree, like if nice small native tree, that you could grow some native flowers underneath, and just kind of create that one little patch. And I think it's like once you take that first step, it's kind of like it builds up momentum, it gets you moving forward. And then it's because I think a lot of people, they don't know, they don't know where to find the native plants. They don't know what the native plants are, except maybe a few big trees that grow in their area. And they're probably thinking like, oh, I don't want that giant tree in my yard. So at least not at first, they might not want that. Maybe one day they'll be okay with that. But I think to start out, it's like starting small is fine, just because partially just start, even if you're just looking for like a native strawberry, there's those all over this country, like it takes time to find them. So like just going through that process of learning about it and finding it, you're going to learn some of the nurseries that sell these plants. And, you're going to, I think it gets over some of that fear of like, will these plants take over? Is it going to look too messy? What are my neighbors going to think? That side. And, I think just recognizing that you don't have to do it all at once, like just.
That's great. Yeah.
Just start small and then build and see what you like. And, with the native veggies, I always tell people, start with one or two, see what you like, try eating them, actually try learning how to cook with them, because, that can be a challenge, just because learning when to harvest, how to cook it, different aspects. And then once you know what you like, then try a couple more, and then expand the ones you do like. And just every year, add more to it. We haven't tried to do everything at once. Every year we've added more.
Yeah. Speaking of cooking, that is actually, we've had a request to actually have a chef on, which somehow he's going to have to teach people how to cook over a podcast. But we've actually been talking about making a rooted discussion, because this one chef, I know a couple other chefs that are really specializing in sustainable cooking or cooking what you catch or find, those kind of things. So that's going to be a future episode. But awesome. I'll let you go first, friend.
Thank you, because you know what, which is really kind of you, because I've been stepping all over you this whole podcast. Like every time I go to talk, Tom has his mouth open, and I just talk right over him. But the one plant, starting with one plant, is a spark, and we talk about connectivity. So if you can start building that connectivity, sure, hopefully it grows and grows and grows. But I wanted to draw you, Daron, into the conversation that Tom and I started in our intro. And I thought this would be a great question to start asking guests is, what is the biggest mistake that you've made with doing this on your property that you've learned from the most from?
Yeah, I mean, really it was trying to do too much at once, and not preparing a site for planting first. So, like I ordered a whole bunch of plants, and, they were all coming in at once, because they were ordered from wholesale. So, all of a sudden I was going to have hundreds of plants arriving, and so they have to get planted fast. And I just ran out of time to get the area prepared. And so along my property, there's one stretch of hedgerow that looks really amazing. Like it's all growing really great. It's full. And then it just ends. And then you just kind of have a few scattered plants, and they were all planted at the same time. And the problem was, at that point there, I ran out of time to get rid of the grass. So I was just planting into the grass, digging rings still, trying to get out. But we lost about half those plants that we planted in that area. And so it's kind of like, and I still, have a bad habit of always trying to take on more than I really have time for. Always want things to change faster.
We're all guilty of that.
But, I think that was my kind of biggest mistake, was though just not slowing down and focusing on the area. So now I have a new rule of like, I have to prepare the area first before I can, get the plants. And so, cause it costs me money, it costs me time. It just,
and it's frustrating.
And I have to,
Yeah, that's really like the best, in my mind, one of the best tips, because I think a lot of people just end up getting way too much, and then it's an investment. Like it's not free. You spend some money on it, and then you don't want to see those plants die because you never got them in the ground. You ran out of time. And so even with some of the projects that we're working on with the nursery, we have it blocked out where it's okay, this is something we're doing in year 1, here's year 2, here's year 3, here's year 4. And typically when you do that, you find that, well, everything I had for year 1, I actually got it done in half the amount of time I had planned. So maybe we'll do year 2 too. When if you do it the other way and say, okay, this is the project I'm going to do it all, a lot of times you find that you took on a little bit too much. So
Yeah.
You want to start off with a success, not a failure.
Yes,
so if
exactly.
you're starting off small and you have success, it should build on it. Well, that is fantastic advice. Thank you, Darren.
Yeah.
See, our failure sparked a whole new line of questions for.
But we would be remiss if we had you on and we didn't ask about this because you're starting a new podcast, and we wanted to ask, what was your motivation behind this? And where can people find that podcast?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, so the podcast is called Growing with Nature, and you should be able to find it on any, kind of listening app that you use.
Awesome.
And it's a evolution of a site I've been running that used to be called Wild Homesteading, and then we transitioned to Growing with Nature. So we started that actually a couple years ago as a blog, and it was really focused around this, that when I was doing my restoration work, I'd often have people ask me, what is restoration? Like they were just, even if they supported it, they didn't really know what it was. And it was always that kind of, again, talking about like, they always viewed it as something that was out there. It didn't really apply to their own place. I mean, I worked in conservation jobs, and the people I worked with, they got it, like why these were important, but then you'd see their own places, and it was mostly lawn and maybe a handful of native plants, but most times it was still just a classic place. And and it was just because it was that disconnect. It was that feeling that nature is out there, it's not here. Restoration is something done out there, it's not what I do in my own place. And but I also had this, I grew up growing food, and I wanted to have that element in it. So it's really, a couple years ago, just wanting to help people bring the knowledge that I had gained through my restoration work and others, to apply it to their own places. So, we always say that we're wanting to help people heal the living world. And it's because, we really do need to do that. Each of us needs to do it. I really believe that it can't just be something that's done by big projects, like we all need to have a role in that.
Yeah.
And, it's like that homegrown national park idea. It's just this idea that, we all need to play our own part. And so I wanted the site to help inspire people to do that, and we've since kind of focused on 5 core areas of like, growing perennial foods, working with native plants, working with wildlife, building healthy soil, and, working with your land. And it was all kind of around that idea of like, how can you make a landscape that provides for you and your family and your community, and also provides for wildlife? And, so native plants had to be a core part of that. You can't exclude them. And, so the podcast was really, we started that as an evolution of that effort that we started a couple of years ago. And really, we felt like a podcast would be, it's a different medium, and we felt like it would be a really great way just to really connect with our community, and, and hopefully inspire people. Every episode I try to share a little story about what's happened on my own place, or, experience I've had, and then kind of dive into how people can then do what I'm sharing on their own place. And it's it's a different format than a blog. Often blogs, it's people are typing in a question in Google, and they just quickly looking for a single answer, and it's less of that inspiration. And we really felt like a podcast could help connect and inspire people.
It's a lot of great information. For us with the podcast, we're realizing the different connectivity we have with our customers and listeners by it's more they kind of feel like they know us. If they didn't know us before, you see each other in a different light, and there's a warmth to it. But what I love about your podcast is, like, for us, our focus is really big picture, but we get a lot of, not so much complaints, but criticism, like, well, how can I transition this to my yard? What can I do here? And I think you're taking more of that approach. I think our listeners, we really recommend that you listen to this, so that it will help guide you on a more personal level to make this journey. We may give inspiration in one way, but we're asking people to do research and find more and how it can affect them. I think you're more that guide help them. So we really hope our listeners find that path and follow you on that.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, it's been great. You know, I've really enjoyed listening to your podcast, and it's just, I hope that people will check out the Growing with Nature podcast. And we just launched, but we have 3 episodes up, and then we'll have new ones coming out each week. And one of the first episodes is all about native vegetables. So that was kind of one of our starting topics.
I will definitely be listening. One of the things and it took me a while to realize that I had done a few music podcasts before this that never really took off. And I realized for certain topics, like if you're into music, you don't need to hear me talk about it because every musician has their own social media site. You can follow your favorite musician all the live long day anyway and get all the information you want. But native plants don't have their own podcast. The environment doesn't have its own podcast. So really people depend on that information from other professionals or people in it to get that and feel connected.
Yeah,
with
and
it. So,
and we're getting to a point where there is a native plant centric podcast for a variety of different people. We've said it, I don't even know how many times. We were kind of not there to provide you the answer, but connect you with the person who has the answer. Try and make it a little bit more mainstream and say, hey, you might like butterflies, but here's how native plants affect butterflies. You may want to do more with food. Here's a way that you can connect with food. We're not going to tell you how to do it, but these guys can, and here's the introduction. But there's other people go really deep into different plants and how the plants are unique or the uses for the plants. So it's nice to have another outlet there that's, in this case, about food.
Yeah, you're providing a niche that's really important, that there's a lack of that out there right now. So you're providing information that we get asked about all the time that we're not experts on, that hopefully, I hope that all these people find you and listen, because I will be a listener. I know Tom's listened. I haven't yet, but I'm sure I'll be a faithful listener.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
I'll be mowing my lawn in the next day or two. So that will be
thinking about how hungry it's making me.
Because it's all about food for me. So I know we started off by talking about your background and what you do, but when did you decide that this is what you wanted to do for a living, or the path that you wanted to go? What kind of influenced you to make that leap that this is where I kind of want to go professionally?
Yeah, it's interesting. As a little kid, one of the first things I ever wanted to be was a naturalist. But I didn't really know that it was a real option, that you could really do it or that you could make a living off of it. So I had other interests. I've always been interested in politics and robotics. So I kind of dabbled in those areas, explored those areas. And it was actually, I got lucky and I got to spend with my wife a year in England while she was doing her master's there. And it was a way of, I got to disconnect a little bit from where my life had kind of been going. And, I volunteered with a wildlife conservation group over there, and later on got a job with the city parks department, kind of just helping manage a park.
Okay.
And it gave me some of my first hands-on experience with sampling ponds and looking at the salamanders and helping to do some plantings. And, it really kind of brought that, what I wanted to be as a little kid, it kind of brought that back to the forefront. And then when I came back to the States, I went back to school. I got a degree in water resources and, started working for the USGS. And then it just kind of, it just continued from there. And it was really I've always felt connected to nature. I always enjoyed hiking and things, but I kind of lost it as a something that I could actually do with my life. And it was kind of that time in England, having that space, because to just explore, and it let me. And I used to take hikes through the English countryside all the time, and it was just having that space just let me reconnect with that childhood passion and bring that back.
Awesome. And here you are. Yeah. So we always end up full circle talking about it. We always end with the same last question, and I'm sure you know what this question is going to be. But we always try to bring it back to native plants, and we're curious what your favorite native plant is.
Yeah, I was definitely thinking about this, and it's funny. I think probably one of my favorites is our native shore pine here. It's it's Pinus contorta. It's also lodgepole pine, it's sometimes called, but it's shore pine tends to get a little scraggly. it's just, it was funny though. The reason that I love that tree is, here in Western Washington, most of our forests are, Douglas firs, red cedars, pines aren't that common. But I grew up in Eastern Washington where ponderosa pines were the main forest tree. And I think the short pine reminds me of that place that I grew up and some of the first forests that I hiked in. So it's kind of like, it's a native plant that grows here. I have some of it in my hedgerows. And it was a way of reconnecting with where I grew up with, but still having it be a plant that's native here.
Awesome.
And I've done that with a few plants. There's a few others that are like, it's not the same plant I grew up with, but it's the native equivalent of it. And it kind of it brings back that kind of connection to that, place that I grew up with, which is still kind of what I always feel really strongly connected to.
That's an awesome choice. Thank you. That's I like how it connects to your childhood too.
Yeah.
That's like, it's kind of all that connectivity just in one property. It sounds really special, actually. Like I'm jealous. So we always end on a final thought, and this is where we give you the floor. You can promote whatever you want to promote, bring up something maybe we didn't discuss, but we give you the floor and it's yours however you want to use it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's been great being on here. And I think, what I would just last message really would want to encourage everybody listening, to not think of nature as something out there, something to go visit, but to really, we're a part of nature. We're not separate from it. Even if you live in the middle of a city, nature is still all around you. And just focus on trying to rediscover that connection to it. And I think, part of that is learning about the native edibles, those edibles are the plants that supported, vast communities of people historically. And we've lost a lot of that, but we can rediscover that and bring back that local connection to where we all live. And I think, that I hope you'll check out Growing with Nature. That's really what we're trying to help people to do, is to reconnect. And, it's not just about native plants for us, but that is a core focus. I don't think there'll be really probably every podcast episode will bring up native plants, even if it's not the focus. And it's because, I don't feel like you can truly connect with where you live without these plants. Like they're a part of it, even if you're growing other, other foods too. It's like, those are all, you need those plants. And I think that is just that part. And, a statement that I remember reading, but I think I read it in Braiding Sweetgrass, by Robin Wall Kilmer. If I'm remembering right, but it was this idea that a lot, of changing our, what sometimes it's called like settler culture into more indigenous culture, or naturalized. It's like this idea of like, take a step, get fully out of the boat. We all, like our ancestors came over by boat, and often the plants and the landscapes we're trying to recreate are from where we historically came from.
Yeah.
And it's like, step out of that boat and embrace where we live now, and reconnect with the nature that's here that you're a part of. And native foods are a big part of that, and native plants in general. And just I really hope you'll check out our site. This is an area I'm really passionate about, and the site exists to help people do that.
Awesome. I love that. Thank you so much. Tom, do you want to go, or do you want me to go?
No, I can go.
Okay.
And that's going back to, I tend to say at the end of every episode that sharing this with a friend is a really important thing, just for the whole aspect of promoting native plants. And another thing I always say is tie it to something like, not everyone's going to care about birds and bees and butterflies or even flowers, but so you got to find something that makes native plants relative to them or relevant to them. And well, everyone eats food. So that's one way to do it. And if people know that they can walk out their back door and make a meal, that goes a long, long way. And it's something people can feel proud of. So that would be my big takeaway. Yeah.
Awesome. So for me, I always have to make it about myself. So, in having this discussion and seeing where Daron is at with his own property, I'm just thinking about my own journey. And this isn't something that I knew that I wanted to do since I was a kid. It's just something that once I found it, I knew I didn't want to not have it in my life. And I look at where I'm at with my my property, and I see Daron as somewhere where I would like to be. So like I'm starting that transition with Agatha's property, and I know that's kind of where I want to go. So I appreciate having to get a glimpse at your journey, to be there and seeing that it's achievable and it's doable, and that this is, you know, a path that I want to take. So thank you for kind of like clearing that path and letting us take a look at it so that we can all, you know, become a part of that. So thank you very much, because it's, you know, this, as my journey progresses, I see this and I go, yes, I think that's what I'd like to do. So thank you. I really appreciate that.
All right. So that's it. That's all. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed listening to Daron Williams from Growing with Nature. For more information, visit his website, which is growingwithnature.org. And make sure you listen to that podcast, which is also Growing with Nature. I found it on Apple Podcasts. It was really easy. And listen to at least 2 of the 3 episodes. Maybe I listened to all 3. I don't know. I was working. I was pulling plans. So, and when you listen to them back to back, they kind of start to blend together a little bit. So I might have listened to all 3 of them there, but you know, it was really good and made me think about a lot of things that I hadn't really thought about just in the backyard previously to that. So
Awesome.
Thank you again, everyone, for listening to Native Plants, Healthy Planet, presented by Pinelands Nursery.
So I'm going to give a huge thank you to the Egocentric Plastic Men for contributing our theme music. Once they have their concert schedule up, I'll make sure I share a date or 2 if anyone's in the area and they want to go see them live. They're wonderful. They're great guys too. You can follow us on Twitter at Pineland Nursery, Facebook at Pinelands Nursery NJ, Instagram at Pinelands Nursery or Native Plants _Healthy Planet, and YouTube at Pinelands Nursery. Don't forget about the question and comment line. We had some great calls on the last buzz. We're hoping to get some more for next week's buzz. You can call us at 215-346-6189. I will repeat that, 215-346-6189. Ask a question, leave a comment. When we play your question and comment, we'll answer it or comment on a future episode of the buzz. The Native Plants Healthy Planet Facebook group just keeps growing. Every time I look at the amount of members, I'm like, how did that happen? You know, it just keeps growing and growing, and there's a lot of new faces and a lot of new conversations. And I love there was a conversation today that someone pointed out your comment on don't let perfect stand in the way of good, and hearing people comment about what's going on in other groups that's not happening in our group that I'm very proud to say.
I do want to clarify, and I'm about to clarify this in a group too. That is not my quote. I don't know.
You were quoting someone.
I don't know who originally said it. I've heard it a lot, and that was just what I used there.
Yeah.
So do not say like don't let perfect in the way of good, quote Tom Knezik, because it's not. It doesn't belong to me.
No problem. So let's keep that conversation going. And Tom, don't forget to mention what you're working. I'm looking at your computer. So in the next segment, don't forget to mention that.
So you can listen to Native Plants Healthy Planet directly at www.nativeplantshealthyplanet.com. Might have said an extra W there. It goes so fast now. You can also check us out on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, Stitcher, really wherever you consume your podcast. When you're there, also look up that Growing with Nature podcast. You can ask Alexa to play the Native Plants Healthy podcast. One of the things we've been working on that we talked about in the last buzz was the auction, charity auction type thing, which is going to be a lot of work.
It's going to happen, but some of our former guests actually contacted us and said they would be willing to be a part of this. So Tom and I have been throwing around options like get a private tour of Pinelands Nursery with Tom and Fran and have lunch, or if you're in the area, like do a nature hike with us. But some of our guests said, hey, maybe we'll do a consultation where we help someone plant a native garden, and then the plants are provided for that garden. So there's a lot of other packages that we're really talking about. This is going to happen probably in February, where we have a big charity auction where all the proceeds will go to all these wonderful nonprofit organizations that we've been talking to. So,
but the thing that we also talked about that will be happening probably by the end of next week is so in the very near future is we're going to have T-shirts up. So it'll be some T-shirts. We'll have some just with the logo on it. Some of like catchy catchphrases. Is that a thing?
Tom's first design is my favorite. Tom has a design that I love, and I hope everyone loves.
So we're gonna try and get like 3 or 4 things up there so that you can go if you want to support us. Well, I guess you're not really supporting us because we're taking all the money we make off of it and we're donating it to all these organizations that we get to have on. So, we're not going to get rich.
We're not.
We're passing the buck to the people who really need it. So.
Yeah.
So yeah, with that, thank you everyone. I'm Tom.
And I am Fran. Thanks again, everyone. Darren, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I love this. Next week, we have our next Buzz episode, topic to be determined as of yet. And then the week after that, I know we haven't had a rooted discussion in a while, but we do have one planned for Pollinator Week.
Yep.
So we're really, and it's going to be
some heavy hitters,
chock full of previous guests and heavy hitters. So we're excited about that. So make sure you keep tuning in. And until then, keep it native.
Thank you for listening to the Native Plants Healthy Planet podcast, presented by Pinelands Nursery. Remember to like, share, follow, and comment.